the experience of the Lynd's sample, Muncie people, back in 1924, with that of the people we talked to, you see that the people in 1924 were 2 generations at most away from a totally different world, in which there was practically no mechanical power, in which people mostly lived on isolated farms, in which Europe and Washington were equally far away, and in which traditional ways and customs were very strong. If you then look at the people we talked to from 1976 to last year, they're living under conditions that are practically the same as the conditions of their grandparents. And that's why we find that in many respects, many attitudes, and the way they really live, they very closely resemble their grandparents.
You mean in the modern conveniences, we say that they had, the family life itself has changed, though, hasn't it? Because families are more mobile, they move around, and they're splitting up more.
Well, I hate to start by contradicting you. No, they're not more mobile, they're considerably less mobile. The Middletown family of 1980 doesn't move around nearly as much as the Middletown family of 1924, and that family didn't move around nearly as much as the Middletown family of 1880. I know that runs contrary to what everybody thinks they know, but there's no question about it. It's one of the best established statistical facts there is.
You call your study the myth of the declining American family. Is that indeed a myth?
Oh, yes.
Is the family now as close as it was?
Closer. On the whole, in much better condition than it was in 1924.
In what way is that?
Well, let's look at what ways it could be. The things we tested for, and the tests are pretty good because, let me go back and explain. The great resource we have here in Muncie is a really exhaustive description of social institutions 50-odd years ago. That's something we don't possess for any other place in the United States. So that generally when we talk about social change, we're compelled to talk about the world as we observe it today with more or less accuracy, and to guess what the past was like. In the case of Muncie, we know what the past was like, and we can make real comparisons from point to point in time. We've gone back, for example, and asked all the high school students in all the high schools to respond to a large set of questions that are exactly the same questions that the Lynds asked their grandfathers and grandmothers in 1924. They weren't all their grandfathers and grandmothers literally, but about 30% of them really were. And when we compare the answers, we discover that we can trace differences that we're not guessing at or inventing. We know, for example, how many late nights out high school students spent in 1924 compared to 1977. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but the question having been asked of the same people in exactly the same way, we have fair confidence in the results. Anyway, when we look at all that, what we find is that parents and children spend more time together, that marriages last longer for a combination of reasons, that there is more family participation in religion, a smaller generation gap, apparently more marital happiness, and much less family mobility. If that adds up to a decaying institution, it's difficult to see why.
Well, we hear there, and we know there's a higher divorce rate now, isn't it?
Not materially, no. The divorce rate in Muncie in 1980 is about 15% higher, just slightly higher than it was in 1924, and it's, if my recollection serves me, it's a little lower than it was in 1921. No, it's curious, but that's another place where there's a great deal of speculation nationally because we don't really have good divorce rates before World War II for the country. But in Muncie, every figure has been double checked all the way back to 1890. And we're quite sure of the number of divorces that occurred, and we're absolutely certain there's been no great increase in the divorce rate.
What about the views of the attitudes toward families, or how families themselves view family life in the 70s or 80s?
Well, that's where the myth comes in. Most people believe that the family is in trouble, but not their family. As most people have the comforting illusion that while the family as an institution is in decline, their family, by some happy chance, is in rather good shape. And they take great comfort and pleasure out of this because it constitutes a sort of success, and it's a nice thing. That's one of the functions of the myth of family decline. It makes you feel good about your own family.
Dr. Dennis, in your studies in the black community, did you find pretty much the same thing, or did you find things in contrast? Because things are different in the black community. There's a higher unemployment rate. There's a lot of things.
Well, unfortunately, we have not reached the point where we can give our findings at this point. We've just started. I came here in late July, so we're not at the point where we can make any comparative analysis regarding rates of marital relationships or divorce relationships, what have you. We'll be looking into those particular variables, though.
Do you have expectations? Do you think that yours could possibly follow what Dr. Capel has found?
I don't know. Again, we're talking about the myths versus the realities, and we may find some astonishing data also.
Dr. Capel, you said that the family as a whole is close. Are we talking about the immediate family, or are we bringing back in the old philosophy of grandmother and grandfather living in one roof with their family?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. We have discovered that the kinship network, or what we've sometimes called the composite family, is very strong in Muncie. As Mr. Barr mentioned last night, 71% of the adults of this community have another household in the community with close kin, and at least one, and many of them have 5, 10, 15 households of close kin. And the normal way people live in Middletown these days is interwoven with households of relatives. When we asked people how they spent Christmas, we made an interesting discovery. You don't have one Christmas celebration in the typical case with the presents opened around the tree. You have 3.2. That's because you go to your mother-in-law's house, you go to your brother's house. The family circulates around its various centers. Now, we don't know directly how this compares with the way things were 2 generations ago, because the Lynds didn't happen to ask those questions. But from various indications, there's every reason to think that this pattern of the composite family has been strengthening, not weakening.
Had it not been for the study beginning in 1924, would you continue your study now in Middletown, or would you go to some other community? Why do you continue to come back to this community?
Because it started in 1924, and each time you add a year to that, you add something very valuable. Not only was the 1924 study one of the very first, but they retrospectively built up the picture of Muncie in 1890, so that we're really dealing here, and there's no other place in the United States where you can do it, with a fairly accurate set of data that covers nearly a century. And that's why we have the temerity to hope that there will be people coming back in the year 2000 and the year 2050. The longer the run, the better it gets.
One of the complaints that I've heard as far as the study was the lack of study in the black community in Muncie. Why is it taking so long now to begin the black study?
Well, there's a practical answer to that, and that is that because we were replicating the original study, and the original study, as a matter of policy, left out the black community because they were interested in majority patterns. We also left out the black community, but with the thought that that needed to be seriously tackled, viewed as an independent job, and preferably done by competent black scholars, which is what eventually happened, and that's the purpose of Dr. Dennis's project.
Dr. Campbell, a lot of things mentioned, it seems like, compared with the 24 study, a lot of things haven't changed. What sort of things have changed?
Good. All right. One very important thing that's changed is that there's much less difference between boys and girls, and consequently men and women, than there used to be. In 1924, any question you asked about patriotism, religion, economics, politics, was likely to be quite differently answered by boys and girls in the same family, or by husbands and wives. And this is just no longer the case. That difference has, for all practical purposes, vanished, except with things that are directly related to gender. That is, I won't say that men and women have the same attitude toward marriage now, or toward courtship, but they have the same attitude toward price control. So that on anything that isn't directly related to the roles of the two sexes interacting, they're very, very similar. That's one change. Another change is that the great discovery of the Lynds was that this community right here, which prided itself on being an archetypical specimen of American democracy, was in fact divided into two separated classes that they called the business class and the working class. And while we still find that separation, it is much less marked. They have drawn together a great deal in the interim, and not just by the working class becoming more like the business class, but equally by the business class becoming more like the working class. For example, business class wives never held full-time jobs in the 1920s. Now as many of them as of working class wives do hold full-time jobs.
Getting back to this black question for just a moment. In omitting, in consciously omitting blacks from this study, does that also mean that you omitted middle, upper class blacks who have worked their way into the general pattern of Middletown?
Well, I won't say we consciously omitted blacks. What we didn't do was take the necessary steps to include them in statistically interesting proportions. Now, most of our surveys, and we did a dozen of them, had between 300 and 600 respondents. Now, that will give you only, at most, perhaps 50 black respondents, and that isn't enough to generalize about. See, we didn't cut blacks out of our surveys, it's just that we didn't oversample them sufficiently to draw generalizations about them.
So there could be black statistics mixed in with.
Oh, there are some. As a matter of fact, in the high school survey, we have a respectable number, and there's a paper in preparation on the differences between the responses of black and white students. And we have a variety of other information, but that whole job is going to be done much better and much more thoroughly by Dr. Dennis and his associates.
Getting back to study in general, how well does this project to the rest of the country?
Better than you'd expect. That's the reaction we always get. Well, maybe that's the way it is in Muncie, Indiana, but it is not so in wicked San Francisco. However, even in wicked San Francisco, most of the population live in intact families, and the chance of a child growing up with its natural parents is better than it was in 1900. We, in the case of the family, asked Reuben Hill of the University of Minnesota, who is generally regarded as the countries and perhaps the world's leading authority on the family institution, to tackle just that question. And he wrote a long paper for our book with the title, "Is Middletown Like the United States?" And his answer is yes, in general. On the average, very much so.
One more question concerning the black community. Is it too far to say that you are trying to alienate the blacks and make that a study of its own and not have that correspond with the white study, or do you want it to get it a type of intermingling with it?
You mean separate the black
Right.
Middletown from Middletown 3? Yes, in many ways we'll be looking at some comparative data, the data as performed by Middletown 3. But I think our task is made, in one sense, much easier, and we can become much more creative because we don't have to replicate, as Middletown 3 has tried to do, the Lynd study. We can go in 1,000 different directions, not 1,000 perhaps, but many different directions for the Middletown 3 group, because we're trying to establish a baseline, establish a basis for the data itself. There are no previous traditions that we have to conform to in order to complete our study.
So, such as racial problems in Atlanta, Georgia, or problems in New York or something like that, would not correspond with what's going on here if you were to study a black community in general.
Well, we're looking at some external factors that impact upon the black community here, and maybe certain things that happen in New York have impacted upon or have influenced the attitudes and behavior of black Munsonians. In that case, it's very significant.
Dr. Dennis, are you looking at things like education, ability of the black? What are some of the other things?
We're looking at religious attitudes and values. We're looking at how people earn a living here. We're looking at the role of women in black Muncie. We're looking at how blacks interact within their communities. We're looking at how blacks interact within their families, relationship, things of that sort. So there are many things we'll be looking at.
Capital, how did you conduct your interviews? Was it a strictly formal question and answer thing, or did you sit in bars and talk to people too? Or
Oh yes, the Lynds had what they called an eclectic method. We're even more eclectic. That is, because it's such a large study and involves many people, we had at one time or another 23 people working on it. We had an opportunity to use almost every method known to social research, so that the work included a great deal of informal observation, participant observation. The three of us, Barr, Chadwick, and myself, lived here with our families, sent the children to school and listened to what they said when they came home, went to various kinds of occasions, and then the interviewing was some of it directive, some of it non-directive. One study is a depth study of family roles in which people were simply encouraged to talk at enormous length. Other studies were done by mail, one or two inquiries by telephone. As far as we could, we tried to suit the method to the requirements and also to follow what our predecessors had done, so that the information we got would be as comparable as we could make it.
there have been news accounts of this as it's been going on, but did most of the time people realize that they were being looked at under a microscope for a study? Or?
Well, all I can say is that nobody could imagine a better reception than we had here. The hundreds of people that we interviewed, the thousands who filled out questionnaires for us, were just as gracious and helpful as they could be, and it was almost ridiculously easy. That a social research is often an uphill job, like selling patent medicines from door to door. And there was at least enough. I don't think we were very conspicuous, not nearly as much as we have become now. But there was enough low-level awareness of the study so that we rarely had to explain to people what social research is, or why people from Virginia and Utah were wandering around Muncie asking questions.
Did you
returned to Muncie in 1968, would you expect that your findings might have been a little different than they?
Yes, that's all those intervening points are the lost opportunities. Sure, and that can't be recaptured. We cannot find out what the data would have looked like if we'd come back in 1968. I think myself that 40 years is too long a stretch. The Lynds themselves came back in 10 years, and that was a very valuable inquiry. And Robert Lynd always had the intention of doing a third Middletown study, but somehow circumstances never allowed him to do it. I would think that it would be a great pity if we waited another 40 years for Middletown 4.
It seems to me that the whole cycle could run through before you return. Because a lot of the studies that they've done on college campuses of attitudes of college students, there was such a shift and then kind of a return to traditional values.
That's right, although it is sort of doctrine among social scientists that college students are bad subjects. They're too volatile. That is, they're trying out new attitudes, and their attitudes change much faster than those of their elders. So that some of that volatility is just result of the fact that they're in college and experimenting with current ideas and intellectual fashions. Some of it's real.
You expect this study to be an ongoing thing, then you do not plan to put it to the side for another 30 or 40 years?
Well, that's the significance of the event that we're celebrating today. Unfortunately, we don't have and couldn't get, perhaps it wouldn't be good for us if we could, the ongoing funding that it would take to be sure that we can go on studying Middletown. But the existence of the center makes it possible for anybody to pick it up at some point where it's possible to do so and start with all the accumulated data and files and working papers at his fingertips.
Do you expect or do you plan to go to any other community within the U.S. to do a similar study?
No, sir.
Have a comparison?
No. We can't do it because we don't have the background. See, what makes Middletown so valuable is that nearly a century of ongoing observation, and there's no way we can create that in some other community.
Another question on the black study, and that question is, since you're not following in the footsteps of the Lynd study, what type of advantage do you think that will prove for your research?
Okay, I think we can free ourselves to look at various other aspects of black life. For example, one of the things that might be possible is to look at barbershop society, or look at the beauty culture, I'll use that word. These are things that the Lynds didn't look at, but these are things that are very important in the black community in terms of the black grapevine idea. We can look at the impact of, for example, nationalism of the 1960s on black Munsonians in 1980. What was the impact of the Muslims, for example, on the politics and religion of the present black community in Muncie? These are things that allow us to be creative in our approach to ways of looking at the black community.
Dr. Campbell, if you were not following in the footsteps of the Lynd, what would be a major question that you can get approached on?
Well, we actually have broached a couple of questions that they didn't take up because they weren't there to take up. One of them has to do with the intrusion of outside influences. And of course, there are two vast influences that did not exist in their time. One is television. Radio broadcasting just wasn't on the same scale or did have the same intensity. And the other is what we've called the federal presence, which is a sweeping sort of change. In 1924, there was the post office and an occasional visit by U.S. Marshal, and that was it. Now that we have identified 123 separate federal programs that have been active in Muncie in the last 10 years, and the direct expenditure of federal funds is about $1,000 per capita per year. and a very large proportion of our fellow citizens are government employees, and a much, much larger proportion depend for a good piece of their income on federal funds.
How much money was spent per capita?
About $1,000 per capita per year. The more interesting estimate, I think, is the fact that more than 50% of the population, the Privacy Act prevented us from doing one study we wanted to do to get it exactly, but it's clearly over 50%, are dependent on federal funds for their income. Not all their income, but a significant part thereof. And that is by no means restricted to the poor. There isn't a physician or a professor or a landlord, I suppose, who does not receive part of his income, in many cases a large part of his income, from federal programs. Now, you would have expected both of these influences to have changed local institutions much more than they have. To take a vivid case, there was practically no federal contribution to local government in 1924. Now, Muncie city government is supported to the extent of about 60% of its budget by federal funds in various forms. Has this affected a transformation of municipal politics? I think not. And so the puzzle has turned into not so much tracing the influence of the federal presence, but accounting for the way in which it seems to have been neutralized. It hasn't been totally neutralized, of course, but it hasn't had as much effect as you would expect looking at the raw figures.
Dr. Kaplow, you've addressed a lot how things are, but as far as why, could the television and the presence of the federal government, things like this, be driving the family back together? What actually is that's caused the family to come back together? Or was it ever separated?
Yeah.
I'm not sure it was ever badly separated. I think the most general answer I can give you is this, that neither television, what we see and experience on it, nor the federal presence with all its good intentions represent happiness for most people. I expect that the reason why the family and the church are so strong in Muncie and in the United States today is that for most people that has been a continued source of satisfaction and reassurance, and these big impersonal and essentially bureaucratic attempts to uplift and improve the condition of the population have not carried the same degree of emotional conviction.
You know, Muncie's gone through some fairly bad economic times. I think even while you were doing your study, there were plants closing, jobs being lost. How do people see their community here now? Did you get into that at all?
Oh, quite a bit. Howard, why don't you talk about that?
In studying Muncie families, we asked what they thought of Muncie as a place to live, as a place to raise a family. One of our purposes in asking the question was to compare today's citizenry responses to those that the Lynds recorded. In the Lynds' time, Muncie was very much self-consciously a leader in the state, very much prideful of its role. Magic Muncie, it called itself, and it saw itself as one of the leading communities in the state, if not in the country. Much of that hubris, much of that pride in community seems gone today. There is much less boosterism of Muncie as one of the best communities anywhere. At the same time, however, Muncie families are convinced that this is a good place to raise children. This is a fine place to grow up. It's a nice place to come back to. So the sense of American heartland, where values are still what they ought to be, and some of that may be mythical also, but while Munsonians are much more likely today to perhaps deprecate that community a little bit. Why would we stay a summer in Muncie when we could go somewhere else? One hears. Even on the radio, one hears those kind of advertisements. Still, when they consider raising their children, when they look at the alternatives, the images of the large cities, they say Muncie is a good place to live. Maybe not the best anymore, but still good, solid, middle American.
Can you give us a few demographics about Muncie, for instance, the population and the black-white population, things like that? Give us kind of a picture of what.
Howard?
When we were studying the city, we weren't sure of the population. We arrived in 1976, 6 years after a census. We went through some attempted estimates, but when people ask us, we would say about 80,000 people in the city as a whole. We estimated the black population at 9%, 10%. It's not so far from the national norm in its black-white composition as it used to be. Back when the Lynds were studying Muncie, it was more like 5%. So with respect to representation of black people, it is much more like America as a whole today than it used to be.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we also thank Ball Corporation for extending their hospitality here so we could do this. There is going to be a lecture by Dr. Capel at 10 o'clock, and you're all welcome to stay for that.